Hi there and welcome back. As you'll tell from the title of the video, I've been challenging myself recently as to what gear to take with me on different kinds of trips. My recent trips have largely been to cities, so there's been a bit of architecture, a little bit of video in some of them. However, it's a real challenge to know what to take because it's relatively unpredictable as to what I'm going to shoot. Sometimes the light is relatively unpredictable. However, recently we went on a short break, 5 days to Bologna. It was more of a family break. We knew it was going to be hot. It was in the mid 30s degrees Celsius, so it's pretty hot. We knew we were going to be walking a fair bit, probably about 10 miles plus each day. And we knew there was going to be a fair bit of climbing. You know, some of the towers in Bologna, if any of you have been there, are up to sort of 500 steps up in very old buildings, so quite constrained, space constrained. As I said, it was more of a family break, so it wasn't really a photography trip per se. So I was going to be fairly opportunistic about what I was shooting. So I decided to take my Z7, my 2470 f2.8 and my 1430 f4 just in case I wanted to do any sort of wide angle architecture type photography. I didn't take a full-size tripod. I only took a GorillaPod with me because, as I say, we were going carry-on only for 5 days and therefore space was constrained, as was weight. So I made the conscious decision not to take a lot of my video gear, so you won't see much video from it. There'll be a bit that I took with my iPhone possibly. We'll see what we can cobble together from that. But it got me thinking because actually during the trip I didn't actually use the 1430. As I say, I thought I was going to use it for some of the architecture photography. As any of you have been to Italy know, the streets are quite narrow and therefore using a wide angle lens can be quite often quite useful. However, what I found was a lot of the places I was shooting were space constrained, so we would climb to perhaps the top of a tower, a church tower, to get a view, but there were other people there. You had to get through tight constrained spaces with your rucksack, and therefore actually you couldn't afford to keep changing lenses. Did I find I missed any shots? I don't think I did. As I say, it wasn't really a photography trip. However, as I've mentioned before, quite often I don't think we use the full performance envelope of the gear we have and also the post-processing techniques that we have available to us. And I thought I'd just use a small number of images from my trip to Bologna just to really discuss that through with you and get us thinking about actually, are we really using the full potential and the full envelope of performance that we have at our disposal? So in one of my previous videos, I've talked about the capabilities in Lightroom to do panoramas and HDR panoramas. I'll put a link above to the video where I did an HDR panorama. However, what I find is quite often the capability within Lightroom is now so good that stitching together multiple images from a 2470 lens can be equally, if not better, than perhaps using a wide-angle lens like the 1430 in certain situations. And this first image is one that really illustrates that. It comes from 4 portrait images stitched together. It was taken at 1/320th of a second at f8 using my 2470 f2.8 lens at 24mm and ISO 100. And it's a panorama at the top of the Cattedrale di San Pietro, one of the cathedrals in the centre of Bologna. And it has a campanile, a bell tower at one end that's only open for a couple of hours a week. And actually, it's two bell towers. There was one that was built in around the, I think, 10th or 13th century, which is circular, and then they built a square one around the round one, leaving the round one in the middle, which means you have to go up this staircase, which goes round and round as it goes up the Campanile, and it's very narrow because it's wedged between the two towers in effect. And when you get to the top, you are in the bell tower part of the Campanile, which has about, I think it's 65 tons of bells up there. The largest one is 33 tons, just to give you an image. And this shot was taken, it's not a panoramic view, there are a number of windows on each side of the Campanile with shutters on, and you have to lean out to get photographed. So I took 4 portrait orientation images with my 24-70, and whereas I think my 14-30 would give me about 114 degrees field of view, whereas this, when I worked it out from a map, is about 150 plus degrees. So I was able to get a much wider field of view from a very narrow opening in the tower. What you can also see is that actually, if you look at the vertical lines on the towers, and the reason I picked these images is because there are a lot of vertical lines in Bologna. You know, the architecture, there's a lot of vertical towers, so actually when you stitch things together, or if you take images with a wide angle lens, you're bound to get some distortion, which will really show up with those vertical lines. And what you can see is that on this image, this is almost straight out of Lightroom. I did one small amount of cropping, but Lightroom has managed to fix those vertical lines to be actually vertical. And by shooting with 4 images and stitching them together, actually you get less distortion probably than you would by using a wide angle lens. Now, in my favour, I had really good light, and therefore I was able to shoot at quite a fast shutter speed and a relatively low ISO. I had a good lens, the 24-70 f2.8, but I was shooting at f8. And I had the Z7, which obviously has 45.7 megapixels, which gives you some latitude as well. But it just shows what the art of the possible by thinking. I knew I wanted a panorama, but equally, I knew I had that capability in Lightroom to be able to stitch together images. So the second image is taken from the sanctuary of the Madonna di San Luca, which is right up here. You can just see it on the horizon. It's outside the city, and it has the longest portico in the world leading up to it. It has anywhere between 666 and 670 arches. It's about 4 kilometers long, and it goes from one of the gates in the city wall right up to the church on the top of the hill. We walked all the way up there. It was sort of mid-morning, so the light is quite harsh. You know, this is really strong light in a clear blue sky. And when you get up there, you actually realise there's nowhere you can take a picture looking back into Bologna, which is quite frustrating when you've walked all the way up there. Now, we were lucky. We were there on a day when you could go up to the top of the dome for a small fee. Again, you had to climb up a whole bunch of stairs in a very narrow, constrained situation. I had to take my backpack off on a couple of occasions to get through the narrow stairs and doorways. And when you get to the top, you do get about a 180-degree view, but it's not really back down into Bologna. So what this is a panorama stitched together from 10 portrait shots, and that gives you about a 30,000 pixels across by 5,600-ish pixels on the vertical, which is quite a large image. It was shot at 1/400th of a second at f8 again, ISO 100 using the 24-70 f2.8, but this time instead of shooting at 24mm, I was shooting at 70mm to really crop in a bit, and that's why I needed 10 shots to stitch together. And what you can see is that it's a really nice panoramic shot round from the rolling hills on the right hand side right down into Bologna on the left hand side. Now what this, you pick this one to show is that actually if you look at this zoom in, I've zoomed this into a 16:9 orientation, which is about just under 10,000 pixels across and 5,600 pixels on the vertical. Now if you work that out, that's a 56 megapixel image there. Now Sony are talking about a 60 megapixel sensor in their new A7R Mark IV. Nikon are potentially bringing out, we believe, the Z8 might have that same sensor. So what we're able to do with a 45 megapixel camera is create pretty much almost a 60 megapixel image. And actually you can zoom into 1:1 and you can still see a lot of detail in there. And that just demonstrates the power of, the resolving power of some of these sensors we're getting in the cameras these days. And therefore, you know, I challenge myself sometimes, you know, do I need to take a 70-200 f2.8 to the top of a tower when I've got this capability that actually if I take a number of images, I stitch them together in Lightroom, am I getting enough detail in the images for what I'm looking to do? If I was perhaps printing this up to A2, I might start to challenge that. But actually, when I'm perhaps putting it on a website or perhaps printing it to A4, there's certainly enough definition in these images for my uses. So this third image, I've picked this really because, as I say, the reason I was taking my 1430 was really because I was considering doing some architecture photography. And this is a piazza in the centre of Bologna, the Piazza Santo Stefano. It's a really nice triangular piazza with a church at one end and some colonnades down either side, and the colonnades are really typical of Bologna if you haven't been there. And here I stitched together 6 images to give me about a 20,000 pixels across the horizontal and 6,500 pixels on the vertical. Again, this was taken at about 1/400th of a second at f8. I shot it at about 26mm on the lens and ISO 100. Here light was a real challenge because it was mid-afternoon. The light was still quite high in the sky, but it was very unidirectional. So on the right hand side you can see the buildings are really nicely lit up with their sort of ochre orange colour. But on the left hand side of the piazza there was a lot of shadow, a lot of harsh deep shadows there. Now, the reason I picked this image is because with all the porticos and the colonnades in Bologna and the towers, there are a lot of vertical lines, and therefore any distortion really stands out. And I think here Lightroom has really nailed this 180-degree panorama by keeping all of those vertical lines quite vertical, and that's pretty impressive, I think. And it really just shows the art of the possible when you consider using the capabilities in your camera to capture the images, but also that post-processing capability in a lot of the software we all use these days, and to see what you can actually create when you bring together the capture and the post-processing. So as I say, the trip to Bologna really got me thinking about, are we using the full capabilities of the performance envelope of the gear we've got, the software, the post-production software? And for me, it was great in Bologna because it got me thinking about the image first. What's the image I'm trying to capture? And then pausing to think, well, okay, what are the different options I've got at my disposal for creating that image? So if it's a panorama, as the images I've showed you are, you know, do I want to create that panorama in camera? Or can I create a better panorama by creating multiple images and stitching them together after the event? So it got me really, as I say, thinking about, not about how is the gear I'm carrying going to limit the shots I can get, but what are the shots I want to get, and how can I use the gear and the software and the post-production, all of those techniques at my disposal, how can I use those to create the image I want to? And that really is, you know, a great skill to just step back from the camera in your hand and think about what's the image I'm trying to create. We've got so much capability at our disposal these days in the world of digital photography, yet are we really stepping back and thinking about how am I going to use that capability to get the image I want? And it's something that I'm doing increasingly, and just pausing even before I've got the camera out to think, what's the image I'm trying to capture and how am I going to go about it? Building in that pause can be really beneficial. It just gets you to stop, think, look at what's around you and slow down the process a little bit. A lot of people talk about using a tripod to slow you down. Well, actually it's a mindset for me. I don't often use a tripod, and therefore it's about pausing before I compose, before I get the camera out even. So I hope you've enjoyed my slight ramble around my trip to Bologna and my thoughts that came out of it. Are you trying to consciously improve the images you take? If so, how are you approaching it? Put your thoughts in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, and I look forward to seeing you in a future video.